Okay, thanks, Annette. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to come here. And so I want to thank the, so how many people know what MICDE stands for? Okay, so some of you. So it's the Michigan Institute for Computational Discovery and Engineering. Did I get that right? And also thanks to the EEB department. So it's a real honor to be here. So climate change provides the context for a lot of my research, and so temperatures are increasing. Last year was the warmest year on record, and this year will almost certainly break that record. The main thing, I think most of you or all of you know that's causing these recent climate changes are anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the increase in global atmospheric CO2 concentration. But the increase you see here is actually only about half the story. This only reflects about half of our emissions. And so what I mean by that is the following. So this is a summary of the global carbon cycle. So each year, humans put about 33 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, and another couple billion tons of CO2 from land use change, primarily deforestation in the tropics. So we're putting each year about 36 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And if you just weigh the carbon, it's about 10 billion tons. But only less than half of that, around half of that stays in the atmosphere. And the rest, the other half, is absorbed by the terrestrial biosphere. We call that the land sink, and the ocean sink. So without these two sinks, atmospheric CO2 would be increasing really at twice the rate that it is currently. So the situation could be a lot worse. And we think these sinks are, in fact, responses to anthropogenic emissions. We think prior to the Industrial Revolution, the global carbon cycle was roughly in balance. And so these sinks are, in some sense, created by us. And they're offsetting, at least for now, about half of our emissions. So one way to appreciate the importance of these sinks is to look at the atmospheric CO2 concentration 150 years ago, or 146 years ago, was about 288 parts per million. And this is where we are now. We're at about 400 parts per million. And CO2 has increased in the atmosphere due to an accumulation of different kinds of emissions: coal, oil, natural gas, land use change. So without sinks, we would be at about 550 right now. And this is the target where we hope to stabilize atmospheric CO2 to limit global warming to about 2 degrees Celsius. That's what the Paris Treaty calls for. And there's some debate as to whether or not 500 ppm would accomplish that. But in any case, we would be, whatever the target is, we would be past it in the absence of these sinks. So these two sinks have, instead of us being here, we're down here. So what causes these sinks? The ocean sink is primarily caused by diffusion of CO2 down a concentration gradient from a high CO2 atmosphere that we've created recently, diffusing into the oceans that are mixing vertically. And it will take the oceans many centuries to come into equilibrium with this new high CO2 atmosphere we've created. Over the next century, for various reasons that have to do with ocean circulation, we expect the ocean sink to weaken somewhat, but probably not go away. So what causes a land sink? That's a big question. That would be a whole seminar unto itself. I'm going to put forth the somewhat controversial notion that much of the global land sink is probably due to CO2 fertilization of photosynthesis. This isn't my idea or my hypothesis. There's a lot of people who believe this, but just for the record, this is a contentious debate. But CO2 is plant food, so you give the plants more CO2, they do more photosynthesis. Some of that can result in more plant biomass, but also more plant litter, so dead plant material that can get incorporated and stored for a long time in the soil. So what will happen to this sink in the future? And so there we're really in a gray area. And before I try to answer that question, I just want to introduce you to the kinds of models that are used to study these questions. So Earth system models, which deal with kind of all the stuff in this picture, the Earth system models are what IPCC uses to make climate projections under different emission scenarios. How much sea level rise are we going to get? How much climate warming are we going to get? But an Earth system model has really three main interacting components. There's an atmospheric circulation model, a model of ocean circulation and the ocean carbon cycle, and a model of what we call a land model, so that simulates land surface processes like exchange of energy, radiation with the atmosphere, and also the terrestrial carbon cycle. Simulations with these global land models is one of the main tools we have to study and try to understand the global land sink and make predictions about what will happen to it in the future. So this is showing some of the kinds of processes that are in a global land model. This model was designed in particular to deal with land use. So there's primary forests, crops, pastures. There can be secondary forests that can be cut down, they can grow back. There's some very detailed physiological and biophysical processes represented in these models on sub-daily time steps. And this model, for example, has 30-minute time steps to resolve things like photosynthesis, which depends on what kind of vegetation is in a model grid cell, and the environmental conditions, radiation, water, etc. And the model deals with fluxes of energy and matter between the land surface and the atmosphere. So a lot of detailed, complicated stuff happening in these models. One of the ways in which these models are incredibly simplistic, however, is biodiversity. So in a global land model, what biodiversity means is plant functional diversity. There is no other kind of biodiversity represented in these land models. And so that's a simplification for starters. But if you just look at plant diversity, how is that represented? Well, usually by about 10 very coarse functional types. So things like evergreen tropical trees, deciduous tropical trees, evergreen conifers, C3 grasses, C4 grasses. So that's kind of the resolution at which biodiversity is resolved in these models. And so what do these models tell us about the future? So a big uncertainty in the future state of the atmosphere and climate is, of course, human behavior. So what will our emissions be from fossil fuels, land use change, et cetera, over the next century? But if we control for that, we take that source of uncertainty out of the equation, and we force a bunch of Earth system models with the identical, what we call a business as usual emission scenario. So if humans just kind of keep behaving the way we have been, these models, they all predict that we're going to go way past our target, but they differ considerably in kind of how pessimistic they are about the future. And the main source of uncertainty here is not in the ocean carbon cycle, it's in the terrestrial carbon cycle. So these are the land model components for these 11 Earth system models. And so the land model, a positive value here means that the terrestrial biosphere is a sink for atmospheric carbon. The terrestrial biosphere is sequestering more carbon than it gives off via respiration. A negative value here, like this model, this model predicts after the year 2050 the terrestrial biosphere will be a source of carbon to the atmosphere. Okay, so this model is this one here at the top. So a lot of uncertainty. So we actually don't have any idea what the global land sink will be like in 2030, much less 100 years. So there's a very large amount of uncertainty here. The spread of these models in 2100 is roughly double our current global annual fossil fuel emissions. So that's how much uncertainty there is in the future of the land sink. And part of this, not all of it, but part of it has to do with how we represent biodiversity in these models. And so one very well-known Earth system modeling result is the prediction in one model, not most of them, but one of these models predicts that the Amazon forests are going to turn into a big grassland because the trees, the virtual trees growing in these models cannot tolerate the heat and decrease in rainfall that is predicted to occur in the Amazon later in the 21st century. But there's just one kind of tree in the Amazon in this model. So that tree that has a particular a set of functional traits or parameters that describes the physiology, morphology of that tree, that kind of tree cannot tolerate the future simulated climate conditions. Scheider et al. Made what I think are some pretty insightful and reasonable comments about this prediction. So in reality, one might expect that phenotypic plasticity, local adaptation, shifts to more drought-tolerant forest tree types may buffer the impacts of decreasing precipitation and thereby avoid a catastrophic dieback of the Amazon forest. So I think a lot of ecologists would agree with this. The problem is how do you incorporate more functional diversity in some kind of non-arbitrary defensible way into these models? Because we're not going to put all the plant species in the world. We're never going to have the data or computational power to represent all of those species in models. So we have to simplify in some way. So kind of the big questions that my lab tries to answer are: how does plant functional diversity affect the carbon cycle response to climate change? And we can think about both the effects of alpha diversity or within communities local diversity on ecosystem functioning in the carbon cycle, but we can also think about beta diversity. And so that's a lot of what we're focused on in my lab, is trying to understand how changes in species composition would affect things like how does the carbon cycle respond to droughts and climate change. And if we can understand all this stuff, right? So suppose we had perfect knowledge of these processes, we would still have to figure out some tractable way to represent functional diversity in Earth system models. So for example, what are the key axes of functional variation? So how do we simplify all the different kinds of traits and axes of plant functional diversity into some manageable number of traits or axes that are the critical details that we need to put into an Earth system model? And how is functional diversity maintained in ecosystems? And we need to make sure that the Earth system model represents those processes or forms of spatial or temporal heterogeneity that allows plants in the real world to coexist. Because otherwise, there's not going to be any, the Earth system model is not going to maintain diversity. So an outline for the talk, I'm first going to talk about leaf functional diversity, and we're just going to ask a simple, we're actually not going to ask the question how many axes. That's a bad way of saying it. The question is there just one axis of variation, or is there more than one? We don't know how many axes. I'm going to talk about how tree species coexist with each other, so how diversity is maintained in forests, and how does forest biomass respond to changes in precipitation, so droughts or long-term climate change. And in particular, if tree species composition changes in response to climate or drought, how do those changes in species composition affect how ecosystems, how biomass or carbon storage at the ecosystem level responds to climate? And so kind of two themes that I'm going to develop or try to track through the talk. Number one, I'm going to illustrate some different computational approaches that we use in my lab. We'll try to not get too lost in computation and stay focused on some biological questions, but I'm going to give you some different examples, Bayesian computational approaches, a numerical approximation for solving for the equilibria of meta-community or landscape scale community dynamics models, and I'm going to talk about some experiments we've done with a land model, so the land component of an Earth system model. Okay, so leaf functional diversity is just one axis or more than one. There's lots of plant species in the world. This is a beautiful map of plant species diversity. But as I've already mentioned, in these global vegetation models or global land models, there's usually roughly 10 different functional types represented. And in each model grid cell, which is usually like 1 degree latitude by 1 degree longitude, or roughly 100 by 100 kilometers, there's usually just one kind of plant per grid cell. So most ecologists think this is a problem, and the question is what to do about it. Because again, no one has ambitions of parameterizing 300,000 plant species in a model. So what can we do that's simpler than that, but that deals with biodiversity in a reasonable way? And so one idea that has been put forward to deal with at least one aspect of plant functional diversity, which is a diversity in leaf traits, is this thing called the worldwide leaf economic spectrum, which essentially characterizes correlations between different leaf traits. So each of these is showing the correlation among 3 different leaf traits, and a lot of these correlations are very tight. Like here, some of them are much looser, or the absence of strong correlation, like here. But essentially, what the leaf economic spectrum is, and just these 2 papers alone have now been cited on, according to Google, like something like 4,500 times. There are 6 traits that are strongly correlated across the global flora. So this is based on a data set called the GLOPNet data set. GLOPNet is the Global Plant Traits Network, which includes about 2,500 species. So a bunch of species for which 6 traits that we think are functionally important are available, and we can characterize these relationships. So one of the traits is leaf mass per area, or LMA. I'll say LMA over and over in this talk, so forgive me. It's leaf mass per area. It's the inverse of specific leaf area. And that's positively correlated with leaf lifespan. Okay, so species that have high leaf mass per area tend to have long-lived leaves. And then there are these 4 mass normalized traits. So this A mass, that's the photosynthetic capacity of a leaf per unit leaf mass. R mass, that's the dark respiration rate of a leaf per unit leaf mass. And then we have nitrogen and phosphorus contents, again, as a percent of the leaf mass. And so those, when we normalize these traits by leaf mass, they're strongly correlated with each other, and they're negatively correlated with these 2, LMA and leaf lifespan. And so this is what the covariances look like, some of the covariances, when you deal with mass normalized traits. If instead you normalize these 4 traits by leaf area, you get much weaker correlations. And so this whole idea of a leaf economic spectrum, a single axis of variation that explains most of the variation in 6 leaf traits, that all goes away when you normalize the traits by leaf area. So the very strong correlations observed when you normalize by mass, that has been essentially interpreted as evidence that the traits should be mass normalized. Okay, you get better covariance, you get this nice leaf economic spectrum, so you should normalize the traits by leaf mass. One of the things we've learned, however, is that normalization itself can induce misleading correlations. And so Jeannie Osnes led a paper on this topic. We published this in Science a couple years ago. And so kind of the nugget of the main idea goes like this. Suppose that this is what the world is really like. Okay, so this says that that traits, the thing that determines the amount of trait in a leaf, like the total amount of nitrogen in a leaf, or the total photosynthetic capacity of the entire leaf. Suppose that it's the leaf area, not the leaf mass. Okay, and that what increasing the leaf mass per area does is extends the leaf lifespan, but really has no effect on photosynthesis or respiration. So suppose that were true. And suppose that all these traits were actually not correlated with each other. So this null model allows for the observed correlation between LMA and leaf lifespan, but assumes that there are no other meaningful correlations among these traits. So these are just, each dot is like a species. It's a random sample from a normal distribution, and these are uncorrelated normal distributions. So this, for example, is photosynthetic capacity per unit leaf area versus nitrogen content per unit leaf area. Now what if we said, let's see what does this look like if we take these area normalized traits and normalize them by mass instead. And so the way you convert an area normalized trait into a mass normalized trait is you divide by leaf mass per area. You divide by LMA. And when you do that, you get something that looks like this. And this looks extremely similar to the mass normalized leaf economic spectrum that you get from GlopNet. Now these two things, this null model, which has no meaningful correlations, and this data set are not the same, right? So if you stare at this, you can see there are some differences. But one of the things we were able to show, and I'll spare you the details, but we were able to show in this paper that in fact not everything, but most of what's going on here is just artifacts due to normalization, and that's it. So one of the conclusions from this paper was that if you look across species, across the global flora, traits that are associated with photosynthesis or metabolism are primarily area dependent, not mass dependent. So it's the area of the leaf that primarily determines its photosynthetic capacity, its respiration rate, and the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus in the leaf. So area, we think, is a better normalizer than mass. It doesn't give you a one-dimensional leaf economic spectrum, but there are biological reasons to normalize these traits by area. But area is not a perfect normalizer either. So we came up with something where a way to quantify variation that actually doesn't depend at all on how you normalize the traits. So basically, if you take the logarithm of a mass normalized trait and regress it on the logarithm of LMA, and then you just take the residuals. So this is like the residual variation in the trait that's not explained by leaf mass per area. It turns out if you do the same thing with an area normalized trait, you get the exact same residuals, the exact same numbers. And so that may be kind of confusing, but this is, if you spend a few minutes with pencil and paper, you can work this out. So we call this normalization independent variation. And it's easy to quantify, but it's hard to understand. A lot of this stuff is really confusing. This is the most confusing, simple problem that I have ever encountered. And although on the surface a lot of this seems like it ought to be extremely simple, it's actually pretty confusing. And so this normalization independent variation has some nice properties, but even though I work with a global land model, I didn't run out and go try to stick this in our global land model. So it's really not very satisfying in terms of mechanism or process. So we tried to come up with something better, something that can deal with leaf trait variation in a way that we think is both statistically meaningful and also has some biological basis, so not just like purely statistical models. And so this work was led by my postdoc, Masatoshi Katabuchi. And so we have a pretty simple hypothesis, which is just that if you decompose leaf mass per area in this way, so we're going to assume that part of the leaf, the LMA, is only contributing to photosynthesis. And part of the LMA is only contributing to how tough a leaf is, so how long it can live. And basically our hypothesis is that this partitioning will allow us to understand leaf trait variation and predict all sorts of patterns and be useful. So, so there's this thing that we call LMAP. It's the photosynthetic leaf mass per area, and it consists of things like chloroplasts, and it determines rates of photosynthesis and all the metabolism that's associated with photosynthesis. And then there's this LMAS, the structural LMA, which determines leaf toughness and how long a leaf can live and how long it will do photosynthesis, but doesn't affect the instantaneous rate of photosynthesis. Now, it turns out that it's hard to chop up a leaf and figure out which parts are doing photosynthesis and structure. And so there is some hand-waving going on, and not all physiologists we've presented this to are enamored of the idea. But what we have been able to explain a variety of seemingly contradictory patterns. So for example, if you look across species in the global flora, what I showed you from Jeannie Osnes's work was that traits across species are often primarily area dependent. It turns out within species, these same traits are often mass dependent. So these are cross sections of leaves within a single plant's canopy from the shade to the sun. So LMA, leaf mass per area, is increasing from shade to sun. And this leaf layer, this is the palisade mesophyll, where most of the photosynthesis is happening. That also increases from shade to sun. So this is what mass dependence looks like. This is a case where the photosynthetic capacity of the leaf does depend on the leaf mass, because you increase the mass of the leaf, you double the LMA, you double the photosynthetic capacity of the leaf. That's what often happens within species. It's not what happens across species. Because when you double LMA across species, primarily what you're getting are tougher leaves, thicker leaves that are more durable and have a longer lifespan, but not necessarily twice the photosynthetic capacity. It turns out within species, that relationship between leaf lifespan and leaf mass per area often goes the other way. So across species, leaf lifespan increases with LMA. Within species, at least across a light gradient, often the sun leaves have shorter lifespans than the shade leaves. Okay, so high LMA, short leaf lifespan, low LMA, long leaf lifespan. So a lot of kind of contradictory stuff here. And I don't have time to present all the details, but this simple hypothesis actually allows us to explain all this stuff. So what we did was, number one, we took the GLOPNet data, this global plant traits database that has 2,500 species, but only about 200 of them have all 4 of these traits measured for the same species. And we also got another data set from our collaborators, Joe Wright and Kaoru Kitajima, who used construction cranes to haul people and ecophysiological gadgets up into the canopy of a couple tropical forest sites in Panama. So this is a data set that has interspecific variation, but also within species variation. And so here's our model. So again, we're assuming some fraction of a leaf's total LMA is just contributing to photosynthesis. And the remaining fraction is just contributing to structure and toughness and leaf lifespan. And then we link these LMA components to things like photosynthesis, respiration, leaf lifespan. And so here's the first kind of computational thing I'll talk about, which is an analysis where we used a Bayesian hierarchical framework and a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm to estimate a very large number of parameters. So in fact, one parameter for each leaf in the data set. So the black is showing data, and these blue things are things we haven't directly observed. And so we have to estimate those for every single leaf. So this is kind of what the structure of the model looks like. Again, the black, this is data. These are observations. And all the blue stuff are things we have to estimate. So there's a lot of parameters here. And there's a potential to overfit the data. So we also did some randomizations where we fit this model to data sets where we had randomized some of these traits with respect to each other to help us evaluate how well the models are working. So when we look at the GlopNet data, the different colors here are deciduous evergreen trees. The gray dots that are kind of in the background, that is the randomized data. So if you want to see if our model works, so in other words, how good is this correlation, you should compare it to how good the correlation looks for those gray dots, the randomized data. So for example, if we look at photosynthetic capacity per unit leaf area versus LMA, so this is just the raw GlopNet data, so not much of a relationship there. Photosynthetic capacity versus this LMA component that we've kind of backed out of the data set. So that's a pretty good correlation. It's better than this one. It's also better than the spread you get when you apply our same model with all the degrees of freedom and all the latent variables to a randomized data set. Similar story with respiration. Leaf lifespan. So in GlopNet, there's already a pretty good relationship between leaf lifespan and LMA. It gets even better if you pull out just the component of LMA that's contributing to structure or toughness. Because a lot of the LMA that we think is just contributing to photosynthesis is adding noise to this relationship. So the real relationship is probably much better, something like this. So this model, this analysis works pretty good for the GlopNet data set. It also works pretty good for this Panama data set I described. In the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you much about that, other than to say in the Panama data set, we're also able to explain a lot of these within species patterns that appear to contradict the across species patterns. So leaf functional diversity. So how many axes? Well, we think there's at least two. So we developed a scheme that has two axes, two independent axes of leaf trait variation, photosynthetic and structural LMA components. And if we consider both of those separately, we can explain all sorts of patterns in these data that you cannot explain with a one-dimensional leaf economic spectrum. Okay, so tree species coexistence. So how is functional diversity maintained in forests? First, we might ask if we're running Earth system models, why do we care about coexistence at all? And so it's basically because we care about ecosystem functioning. So we think diversity has all sorts of important effects on ecosystem functioning. One that we're particularly interested is this one. So diversity in some sense provides the ingredients for shifts in species composition or shifts in the functional properties of ecosystems. So for example, in a diverse landscape where lots of species are present, the functional composition of the plant community can change much more rapidly than it would if you were just relying on, say, long-distance migration across latitude. So what kind of coexistence matters for Earth system models? So I'm going to blitz through some of this, but basically there's a number of ways that plant species can coexist, and only some of them are relevant to an Earth system model. So for example, neutral drift, right? So the neutral theory of ecology deals with species that are functionally identical. So we're not interested in that coexistence mechanism. We're not interested in how many redundant species are in an Earth system model. We're specifically interested in the species that are not redundant, the ones that are functionally different. So we've done some work and developed kind of a computational framework to solve for the equilibrium of plant meta-communities. And the equilibrium is important because it's one way that you can ask the question, how many species can coexist in this landscape? So when the whole system is at equilibrium, who's left standing? That's one way to ask questions about coexistence. So we imagine there's like a landscape or a meta-community with different kinds of patches. So we've got red patches and blue patches. The blue trees are a little more competitive in the blue patches, and the red trees are a little more competitive in the red patches. You can extend this to any number of species and any number of patch types as you want. We assume that some fraction of the seeds that are produced in a patch fall into that patch or disperse locally, and some fraction of the seeds get distributed across the whole landscape. So this is a typical meta-community modeling approach. In the simplest of cases, so what's not typical about this is that we are, in each patch, we're simulating a forest dynamics model. So this is like a model that deals with height-structured competition, taller individuals shade shorter individuals. So how can we solve for the equilibrium of this complicated system where patches are getting disturbed at different times? Each patch is continually recovering from disturbance. So no patch is ever at equilibrium. It can take hundreds of years for forest succession to play out. So we can actually, it turns out we can solve this if we make some simplifying assumptions. Well, we can solve this pretty easily if we make some simplifying assumptions. We can also deal with more complicated cases where we relax these assumptions, but I'm not going to try to go through that today. The simplest cases are cases where we know the age distribution of patches in the landscape. So basically that means there's a constant disturbance process. And if there is, so patches are getting disturbed independently. We're not disturbing the whole landscape. Each patch is subject to like a stochastic disturbance process, but with a constant rate. And so the landscape, the age distribution of patches in the landscape eventually settles down to some equilibrium. And we also make the simplifying assumption that when a patch is disturbed, all the plants die. And then the patch is recolonized by seed dispersal. So it turns out in this simple case, to solve for the whole system, what does the whole system look like at equilibrium? All you really need to know is the global seed rain for each species. So what's the density of seeds that each species is raining down on the whole landscape? And that has this ugly expression, but there are things in here like the age distribution of the landscape, the fraction of the landscape that are comprised by different types of patches. And in this picture, there's two types of patches, but there could be any number. And the key thing, the hard thing that we have to simulate is how seed production of each species in each patch type changes with the age of the patch. Age meaning the time since the patch was disturbed. We don't have like a neat equation that tells us that because we're simulating this forest dynamics process in each patch. And the forest dynamics model does not have age-dependent dynamics that we can solve for with a neat equation. So we have to simulate. But the good news is we only have to solve this problem, we don't have to simulate the whole landscape. We just have to simulate the dynamics in one patch of each type, and then we scale up to the landscape using these probability distributions. So we have a little numerical algorithm that allows us to solve this equation. What I mean by solving the equation is this global seed rain also shows up here. So the seed production in a patch and the transient dynamics that a patch undergoes depends on the global seed production. So we're asking, what is the value of global seed rain for each species that satisfies this equation? And we have a little algorithm, an iterative algorithm that allows us to solve for that. This can be extended to much more complicated cases where, for example, the disturbance rate of a patch depends on the state of the patch. Different plant species may be more or less flammable, for example. And this all becomes more complicated, but the same kinds of approach, just with more integrals and sums and other messy stuff, still works pretty good. So this is the kind of results we get. This is when the landscape or the meta-community is at equilibrium. This is showing the transient dynamics in a patch. So the black bars are for late successional species. The red bars are for early successional species. This dotted line at the top, that's an analytical approximation for where this patch would be going if the patch was never disturbed. And you can see it can take a long time to get there, right? It can take like thousands of years for a patch to get to that equilibrium. And it will almost certainly be disturbed before it gets there. This dashed line, that is like the age distribution of the landscape, or what's the relative probability that a patch would be in different ages. And so you can see there's a high probability that a patch is in an age where there would be a fair amount of local diversity. And so you can do this for different assumptions about rates of seed dispersal, different degrees of habitat specialization. The upshot is that what we've learned from this, and we think this result is qualitatively correct, is that if there's heterogeneity in the landscape, which there basically always is, and if species have adapted to specialize on that heterogeneity, if there's a disturbance process, which there basically always is, force dynamics are slow enough so that you can maintain a pretty high level of local diversity. Even if you have a species that, in the absence of disturbance, would take over a patch, it can take a very long time for that to happen. So this is like the stand age distribution. So what fraction of patches in the landscape are old enough, have not been disturbed for long enough for the dominant competitor to take over a patch? Almost none. It almost never happens. So we think that this is an important coexistence mechanism in reality. Most Earth system models can't deal with this. They don't represent things like the demography of plant communities. But there are a few Earth system models that have land model components that deal with disturbance, deal with forest demography, and probably in 10 years, more and more Earth system models are moving towards incorporating the kinds of details you would need to maintain tree diversity via this mechanism. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about how forest biomass responds to drought, and in particular, ask how would changes in species composition that are driven by drought or climate change, how do those changes in species composition affect the way the ecosystem responds to drought or climate change? And at this point, I want to briefly acknowledge the computing resources that the University of Florida has provided to us for almost free. We have this thing called Hypergator 2, and according to their website, it's the world's 136th most powerful supercomputer, which I guess is supposed to be impressive. But it is one of the largest computing facilities at a university. So there's 50,000 computer processors. We even made it to, this is the local Fox News. We didn't get featured on the Fox News. I guess that's a good thing. So some of the work I've already presented, we needed to use a big computer cluster. But what I'm about to talk about would really be impossible without a high-performance computing facility. So what we know from several decades of ecological research into biodiversity and ecosystem functioning although I'm sure there's someone in the audience who would like to punch me in the face for showing this, but a lot of ecologists believe this, not all. And what we believe is that more diverse plant communities are more stable, are more resistant to things like drought. Dave Tillman has a pretty simple explanation for this particular result, which is that species-rich plant communities are more likely to contain at least some drought-resistant species. There's been a recent meta-analysis of 46 experiments that manipulated species diversity and basically got the same result that Dave Tillman did 20 years ago, which is that more diverse communities are more resistant to both extreme drying and extreme wetting events. So alpha diversity moderates ecosystem responses to drought. What about shifts in species composition or beta diversity? And so I think we know much less about that second question. And one of the ways we've been trying to get at that question is using a land model, a model of the terrestrial biosphere that was designed as an Earth system model component. So this is a model that's being developed at GFDL. It's a geophysical fluid dynamics laboratory. It's a NOAA climate modeling facility. And so we have incorporated, it's actually the same forest demographic model that I used in the previous part of my talk. We've put that demographic model into GFDL's global land model. And so we simulate the demography of tree cohorts, taller canopy layers, shade shorter layers. There's competition for water. And again, some pretty detailed physiological and biophysical stuff. Radiation, energy balance of multi-layered canopies. Fortunately, he's the person who dealt with this. It makes my head hurt. And En-Cheng Wang was a postdoc in Steve Pacala's group at Princeton, and he did most of the heavy lifting to incorporate the forest dynamics model into the land model. So with my postdoc, Tao Zhang, so we helped develop this model, and now we've taken it and we're doing kind of ecological experiments with it. And so we did a series of experiments where we defined 16, you can think of them as species or allocational types. They're plants that differ in their allocational strategies. So their ratio between their root mass to their leaf mass, how the density of leaves in their canopy or the leaf area index of their crowns. This is the same trait space we explored, just expressed in a different way, but it's the same. So 16 species or types that have different allocational strategies. And so we performed a series of simulation experiments at 10 sites in the eastern US. We messed with the precipitation to create dry scenarios and wet scenarios, and drought experiments. We looked at different assumptions about how tree mortality rates depend on water deficit, which didn't end up affecting our conclusions. But I'll just point out that what I'm about to present, that I've boiled down to about 2 slides, involves about 3 million grid cell years worth of simulations, each with a 30-minute time step. So this is a really large amount of computation that went into this. And this is, I'll walk you through this. This is just the trait space. So the rooting strategy and the leaf strategy. The dots is the mean traits across the 10 grid cells where we did these experiments. The bars are the range of results across the grid cells. And so what we see is that the plants, the trait combinations or the species that are most competitive overinvest in roots and leaves. Overinvest in the sense that if they had fewer roots and fewer leaves, they would have higher NPP. They'd be more productive. So competition for water is like driving the plants to be greedy and to basically to steal water from their neighbors. And the plants that maximize NPP are not the plants that produce the most wood biomass. And the plants that are most resistant to a drought have very little leaf area because that reduces their water demand when there's a severe drought. So what I just showed you was a result kind of like this one, where competition has driven plants to invest more carbon in roots and leaves than they should in some sense, if their goal was to maximize NPP. When water is not limiting, which is on the right side where we've artificially increased the amount of rainfall, we see that these strategies, these different ways of defining what's the optimal plant, they kind of converge on the same strategy. So I'm going to go through this real quickly, but the key point, the key take-home message is that if you assume that competition is what determines the distributions of traits in the real world, what this shows is that changes in species composition that are driven by competition actually make the ecosystems more responsive to things like precipitation change than other ways to think about changes in species composition or the absence of change in species composition. So this is kind of like the opposite of what we've concluded about the effects of alpha diversity on ecosystem functioning. I'm going to skip all this. I'm just going to close by showing you a photograph of a bathroom in my house. And you might be interested to know what's behind these doors. And so what's behind these doors, interestingly enough, is a washer and dryer. This was the way the house was configured when we moved in. And a fair amount of shelf space. And we lived in this house for a few years without really using that shelf space. And then one day my wife decided we could kind of turn this into a pantry. And so now we have a lot of breakfast cereals. You know, when it goes on sale, we just buy it and we stick it in the bathroom. We have other snacks here too. So if any of you ever visit us and you go to the bathroom, you help yourself to a snack. But I think this is kind of a metaphor for computational science, right? So we had some extra shelf space, and we found a way to use it. And now we're back in the situation we were in before, which is that we don't have enough space for all of our crap. So the bigger, more powerful our computers get, it's quite easy for us to come up with problems that are pushing the limits of what the computers can do. So basically everything I've shown you in this talk, we've dealt with that problem. And I think most of you have too. So with that, I'll just thank a bunch of great collaborators, and that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so, well, I think that the leaf economic spectrum, I think, is a real thing. And so it's this continuum from short-lived leaves that have rapid returns on investment to long-lived leaves that have slow returns on investment. I think that the thing that I believe is correct is that that is a meaningful axis of variation. What I don't think is correct is that that's the only meaningful axis. So, I mean, to me, the implications of our results are that you cannot meaningfully summarize global leaf trait diversity with just one axis. I mean, that's a very attractive idea to modelers. If you're an Earth system modeler, hey, you know, great, one axis, that makes things simple. But, you know, a lot of things, I mean, what that axis really is a leaf mass per area axis. It's an LMA axis. So when you double LMA, There are cases, there may be cases where if a community shifted from a low LMA, a community dominated by a low LMA species to a community dominated by a high LMA species, what the leaf economic spectrum says is that the photosynthetic capacity of the leaves will go down when you make that change. That may be true in some cases, that's possible, but I don't think that's, it's not necessary. That there are, I could think of counterexamples where that would not happen. So I just think that the kind of the metabolic or physiological capacity of leaves is in some sense decoupled from their longevity. I think those really are two different axes of variation. Yeah.
Could you just give a rough estimate of the computational power needed to run, say, this land model versus the global climate experiment? Are they sort of equal in computational needs, or?
Yeah, so
If you're going to add this to the global climate.
right. The way most Earth system models are now, someone in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the atmospheric model that's doing most of the computation. As we make the land models more and more complex, they may eventually catch up. I don't know if they'll ever catch up because the atmospheric model is three-dimensional. Right, so it's the same spatial array, but many, many layers in the atmosphere. So the land model, no matter how complicated we made them, within reason, they may always be, on the order of 10% of the total calculations of the Earth system model. But nevertheless, for an individual investigator like me, there are immense challenges of running these land models. So NOAA at GFDL, they have their own massive supercomputer whose sole purpose is to run their Earth system model. Actually, that's no longer true because their computer turned out to not be big enough. So they now run their Earth system model at Oak Ridge. But in any case, they have a massive resource dedicated to just them, one project. Whereas, I don't have tens of thousands of processors at my disposal all the time. So for me to run a land model, it's a big pain in the neck. But if you were designing an Earth system modeling experiment, if you made the land model, twice as slow or even 5 times as slow, it probably wouldn't affect the runtime of the Earth system model. Yeah. Yeah.